thank the chairman, and I wish I had time to get into this climate change. Climate change issue at the IMF. I would just say one thing, one editorial comment. I appreciate the chairman's focus on that. I just would say that it's difficult to just make the assumption that lending into a carbon-intensive industry is actually counterproductive to the fight on climate change, when lending could in fact provide capital to companies that have the expertise to make investments in technology and innovation that actually could fight climate change, harness carbon cycle, and innovate in carbon capture and things like that. So starving energy companies of capital or starving countries of capital that are engaging in investments in fossil energy could actually have a counterproductive effect in terms of fighting climate change. But that, I don't have time to go into that. Let me talk about economic reforms and conditionality, because I think that's very important when we talk about the role of the IMF. And the primary role, one of the primary roles of the IMF is to drive meaningful pro-growth economic reform. These economic reforms associated with IMF lending help struggling economies prosper in the long run, not just because of the funds loaned directly. Agree.
And Mr. Barr, let me ask you to suspend. Your last 20 seconds I could not hear. Could the other members of the committee hear Mr. Barr? Okay, I'm seeing shaking heads. I'm going to ask the staff to run the timer back 25 seconds or so. Sorry, Mr. Barr, you just cut out. I think you may want to try again. You might want to back it up about 20 seconds or so.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize. There was a call coming into my phone, and I'm using my phone because I was having technical problems. So thanks for the additional time. I will restate my question. One of the primary roles of the IMF is to drive meaningful pro-growth economic reform. The economic reforms associated with IMF lending help struggling economies prosper in the long run, not just because of the funds loaned directly from the IMF, but because they have a catalytic effect that provides private creditors the confidence to lend into a particular economy. This private credit in turn amplifies the capital pledged by the IMF. Put another way, absent concrete economic reforms, private lenders will be hesitant to invest in struggling economies. So, Professor Rogoff, do you agree? And can you elaborate why economic reforms and this idea of conditionality is important when the IMF is negotiating these loans, especially as it relates to the long-term growth and recovery of struggling economies?
Thank you. Well, for starters, when we're talking about the really poor countries of the world and some that are most distressed now, they need aid. They don't need any sort of loans, although they also need technical assistance and help. But if you get into the larger emerging markets, there's a lot of Chinese money, there's a lot of private money, and when the IMF comes in, it's often because these other lenders have dried up. They're not giving money. The quote-unquote austerity of many IMF programs, and I don't argue that they can be designed better in some cases, but it's coming with or without the IMF. That seems to be little understood. The IMF in these cases mitigates austerity. But I think a big problem, and many speakers have alluded to this, Professor Stiglitz did and others, is that the IMF is legally restricted from saying this ain't going to work. We could give you money, but it's not going to work. It's not realistic in the growth. It's not realistic in the compliance. You need to get rid of some of this debt first. And they're not allowed to say that. That's sort of a problem with the current structure. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. Let me talk about surcharges. Some of my colleagues on the other side, including several on this committee, sent a letter last month to Secretary Yellen that labeled IMF's surcharge policy, quote, unfair and counterproductive. They called for these surcharges to be abolished. However, according to media reports, the Biden administration has rejected these Democrats' requests, citing the importance of surcharges for the IMF's precautionary balances. To any of the witnesses, why are surcharges important for the IMF, and why might the Treasury Department have opposed their elimination? Professor Rogoff, can you comment on that?
I mean, I think after the pandemic, there is a real question of what they should have done something different with the surcharges. I'm not talking about Argentina, but some of the other countries, because the idea is not just to help the IMF's balances, but to encourage countries to repay because it's revolving credit. But the pandemic was truly an extraordinary situation, and to the extent it affects some of the poorest countries, I think there's an issue there. But as a routine matter, I mean, believe me, the surcharges that China's charging and that the private creditors charging are far greater.
Speaking of China,
Add to that, the IMF's own economic model specifies that they do not need the surcharges for their precautionary balances. And it's a really tiny amount relative to the capital base and the lending program of the IMF.
well, let me shift back, Professor, excuse me, let me shift back to China. In the past, some have argued China needed greater influence at places like the IMF so that it would commit itself to international norms. But in 2015, for example, China's shareholding at the fund was increased, and the IMF decided to include the renminbi in the fund's elite currency basket. But Beijing went on to wage genocide in Xinjiang, tore up its treaty obligations in Hong Kong, tightened its grip on the central bank, all while continuing its opaque Belt and Road lending. Professor Rogoff, given these facts, why should Congress listen the next time someone argues that China needs a stronger voice at the IMF? How can we better hold China accountable?
Well, this is a very difficult question. I think back in 2015, the sort of hope for another trajectory, we depend on China to be a big lender. We hope that they'll give more money. We want to bring them in. But this is a very complex issue. I don't think the IMF can necessarily take the lead on this, but things are rapidly moving if you look at the governance in China.
The gentleman's time has expired.